Let's talk about informative speaking. Up until this point, we've flirted with the idea of informative speaking and public speaking, and sure, we've got our feet wet a little bit, but the stakes have been rather low. This week, it's time to start thinking about your own delivery of a tried and true form of public speaking, informative speaking. So, just what is informative speaking? Well, an informative speech is a speech where the goal is to explain or describe facts, truths, and principles in a way that stimulates interest, facilitates understanding, and increases the likelihood of remembering. Put quite simply, informative speaking is one of the most common types of speaking we do. Think about it. Have you ever given someone directions or instructions or taught them how to do something? Those are all forms of information relay. Informative speaking enhances that even more, and the goal here is to construct a robust delivery that informs the audience about something, giving them new information. And you're highly likely to use informative speaking in the future, so be sure to dig deep in the content and activities this week. Though the idea of informative speaking is actually quite simple, that does not mean that the process of delivering an informative speech is simple. So, let's talk about the enhancements we need to consider to ensure we're delivering a good informative speech. First, an informative speech should be intellectually stimulating. This means that it should leave our audience with the perception that the information is new and applicable to them. That's the stimulating part. But don't forget the intellectual part. You're a college student after all, so you can't just give a speech on what puppies are, for instance. That's not intellectual. Use your skills and preparation from other disciplines and courses to tailor an intellectual presentation. If you think your audience already knows a bit about your topic, be sure to consider how to tap into their natural curiosity. If it's highly technical or outside of the realm of common knowledge, be sure you give them enough information so that they can follow along. Next, be sure that your informative speech is relevant. Pick something of importance to your audience. And don't assume listeners will recognize how the information is relevant to them. Incorporate listener relevance links to clearly identify how a particular point may be important to listeners. Remember, relevant statements should be clearly integrated into your speech. You also want to make sure that your informative speech is creative. Remember that we're inundated with information all around us every day. So your audience might need some extra stimulation to pay attention to you. You want them to perceive that information you're giving them. You want them to know that it will yield innovative ideas and insights for them, that they can leave and do something with it. But remember that creativity takes time and energy, and it doesn't just pop up automatically. So you'll need to think creatively and plan creatively in order to deliver creatively. Also, be sure your informative speech is productive. Put simply, this means that you've got to remember that you've got a great opportunity to catch the attention of others, so don't waste their time. You could help them rethink a problem or an issue from a new perspective, take their level of understanding deeper by plotting or mapping out the topic in a visual way. You could equip them with the skills needed to go out and solve real-world social problems, or do something else different entirely, but just be sure you use the time you have with them in a wise and productive way. Next, be sure that your informative speech is memorable. Effective informative speeches emphasize the specific goal, main points, and key facts clearly and often throughout the speech. In addition to being memorable in terms of delivery, you want to be sure your audience walks away with a comprehensive understanding of what you just told them. Remember that you can never be too clear. Finally, your informative speech should be designed and delivered with diverse people in mind. There are a host of different people and personalities and learning styles all across the globe. Don't just present your topic from a one-sided perspective. Develop your informative speech in a way that addresses diverse learning styles based upon feeling, watching, thinking, or doing. So, let's talk about how we accomplish those goals. How do you inform exactly? Well, I'm glad you asked. There are actually a variety of different ways that we can speak informatively. You could choose any of these. Just be sure your reasoning makes sense for the topic and is clearly identified throughout your delivery process. You could describe. This is a method used to create an accurate, vivid, verbal picture of an object, geographic feature, setting, person, event, image. Remember though, you need to give an intellectually stimulating speech. So describing a soccer ball, for instance, wouldn't meet the standard. But what about describing a world that was totally handicap accessible? What would that look like? Do you see how that topic really brings things just one level higher? You could perhaps define in your speech. And you might choose to define, and this is when we inform about or explain the meaning of something. Again, just defining a random word might not be enough, but if we got creative, we might define a term like equal rights, and then inform, pulling in history and current context, just what that word really means. That's provocative, eh? You might compare and contrast. We could compare and contrast, which is a method of informing that focuses on how something is similar to and or different from other things. Think of this as a more scholarly version of apples and oranges, wherein we show how things are different. Let's say you wanted to inform about healthy eating. You could compare and contrast vegetarianism with veganism. Or maybe you wanted to give a speech on working out. You could discuss the differences between Pilates and yoga. Another informative mechanism is to narrate. Now, if you're feeling especially adventurous, you might choose narration as a mechanism of informative speaking. Narration involves explaining something by recounting events, and typically narratives have 4 parts. First, the narrative orients the listeners to the event by describing when and where the event took place and introducing important characters. Next, the event explains the sequence of events that led to a complication or a problem, setting up some suspense. Then, the narrative discusses how the complication or problem affected key characters, and then the narrative recounts how the complication or problem was solved, always bringing a resolution. And then the final mechanism you might choose to do is demonstrate, which is a method of informing that shows how something is done. It lays out a process. A simple way to think about this would be a speech on how to bake brownies, wherein you stand in the front of the class and show that process as it unfolds. But again, that's a little too simple and juvenile for what we want here. So what if you gave a demonstration speech on how to provide social support for those who have been bullied, or how to listen when a friend needs a listening ear? Again, bringing that level just one step higher. Ultimately, the possibilities are endless, and it's up to you to make a decision about what works best for you. As you do, here are some reminders that I want to leave you with. These are things you should always do. First, you should always do your research. Remember that informative speaking can't just be off the top of your head. It's rigorous, and you should show that rigor through your citation of academic research. Remember that you've already started finding those sources, so now it's time to make that content come alive in your speech. Just be sure to cite it orally and in your outline. Second, think about the overall framing of your message. It'll be impossible to cover every single angle, and you don't have to. Just be clear about the limits and the design of your overall argument. Frame it carefully and be sure you cover all your bases without feeling like you have to truly cover every aspect of the topic. Just be sure your audience knows the limits of that speech and the topic. Third, as with all speeches, be sure to incorporate principles of effective delivery. You know what that means. That means engaging in practice, making sure your camera, mic, and setup work. It's all those things that we've talked about so far in this term. And finally, practice and prepare. I know that this should go without saying, but I don't want it to go without saying. You know the old saying, practice makes perfect. Well, it does. The more practice you do, the more perfect your speech will be. So practice. But I want a caveat here. Don't feel like you have to chase perfection. As we've discussed in past weeks, there is no such thing as a perfect speech. So instead, focus on clarity and focus on excellence. Do the best you can with the knowledge you have. Put these principles, into action. And I know that you'll succeed and be a great source of new knowledge for your audience as an effective, informative speaker.